Okay, today we are going to go over the waterfall of a real estate syndication. Here we go. Without further ado, I want to share my screen right here. We're going to start off with a sample property that was purchased. This is the address. Purchase price is 1.05 million and the purchase date of 1/1/2024. You'll see why this date is important. It has to do with how much the returns are going to be for the investors. We have here the list of investors. We have here the capital that each of them contributed to the project. Total of 1.05 million. We're assuming here that anybody who gave money, they gave it of their own. They could have taken a loan out from it, but it would not impact their returns over here. We have two sponsors, and the rest, and they're also investors because they're contributing to this project. And then we have a number of exclusive investors, not sponsors. So the sponsors' contribution, capital contribution, is not going to be included in an acquisition fee. The acquisition fee is here, it's $50,000. It could be anything. It just depends on what the sponsors determine and what they agree upon with their investors. In this case, we're talking about a $50,000 acquisition fee. There are two sponsors. They agree to split it 50-50. So just as a point to keep in mind. Now, we're taking a percentage over here of each of the investors' capital contributed, right? We're taking over the total of the total amount that will be allocated, to the acquisition fee, right? 875, it's basically the entire amount minus those two. So we're summing up all of these, 875,000. So $875,000, this investor C has paid 11.43% of his capital is going towards that. And we'll see why that's important later. Then what we have is how much of this investor's capital contribution is going toward the acquisition fee. You see right here, this is the acquisition fee. Acquisition fee has to equal to $50,000. So how much of investor C is going to go towards that $50,000? We take the $50,000 and multiply it by that percentage of his, which that percentage is based on his capital contributed. So that's that. See, the person who invests more capital, they're going to pay a higher percentage, obviously, and they're going to pay more towards that acquisition fee. This acquisition fee goes to the sponsor or sponsors. So that is the acquisition fee portion. Now, what is investor C's balance after paying the acquisition fee? It's going to be the difference between those two columns. So their capital balance at that point is 94,000. Note that the two sponsors still have their capital balance intact. It has not been impacted. And then we come down here and we have the $1 million, which is essentially the total amount of the capital contributed minus the $50,000 acquisition fee. So those two together. So that's what we have. And here we see just the formula that we use, right? So this column is going to equal to A minus B. Okay, so just for ease of viewing and recalculations. Now, in terms of the ownership after the acquisition fee is removed, so initially, so their ownership is going to be the capital balance after the acquisition fee is removed, divided by the total amount of the project. So here we have the ownership after the acquisition fee is removed. We have these are the ownership percentages. It's only 95.24%, but if we add those, this is their additional ownership percentage for these two sponsors, right? So that's what happens over there. Now, and you'll see why this is important. So that is essentially how we are calculating each investor's investment and their capital percentage and actual capital contributed, and the acquisition fee specifically. Now we're going to go into the second part of it, which is actually the sale. So assuming that everything goes well, the sponsors remodel, they sell it for a higher price, then this is what's going to happen. So I'm going to open this up. So we're going to minimize that. So here what we're going to see is the sale. The sale, let's assume the sale goes to 1.5 million. Sale date is on June 1st and same property. So what happens? Actually, we're going to need to open both of these up so we can see the formulas. Hopefully you can still see this. Now, what happens is as follows. So how much of the return? The return is how much? It's $450,000, right? It's the sale price minus the purchase price. Let's assume that's what occurred and there are no other expenses over here. So what is the total percentage return is going to be the percentage return is going to be the return over the purchase price. That's the percentage is 42.86%. Now the time that it was held is the difference between June 1st and January 1st, which is 152 days. Now, what do? Is we want to determine how much is going to go, how much of the return is going to go to each of the investors. Now, for these purposes, the sponsor is also an investor, right? So the sponsor is going to get part of the $450,000 multiplied by their ownership percentage of the total. And same all the way down. So each person is going to get a percentage of the total return. Now, okay, so that's that. So we see down here it equals the total $450,000. And each of them are going to get. So we see here sponsor A, who put in $100,000, is going to get $53,000. Sponsor C, who put in $100,000, is going to get $40,000. And the reason is because of this percentage of the acquisition fee that was allocated to them. So that is the portion of the $450,000 return off the bat. Now, something called a pref or a preferred return. Now, this is negotiable. So if you are an investor, then speak with whoever the sponsor is, and they're going to offer a rate, a preferred rate. It could be zero. And then you could potentially negotiate for a higher waterfall. But typically, there's some sort of relationship and balance between the two, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the preferred rate we see here, a preferred rate could be any amount. It could be 10%, it could be 5%, it could be 2%. It's all going to depend on the project itself, what the expected returns are, and it's going to depend upon who the sponsors have in terms of if they need your money or not. If they need your money, they're going to be willing to give more to entice the investor to come and invest with them. Now, so this is the preferred rate. And then there's going to be a waterfall rate. The waterfall rate also is going to have some negotiations involved, and they were between, it could be lower than 50% even, could be up to 100%, which typically is reserved for the sponsors, at least in this case over here. So then what is going to be the preferred return amount? We have 7% multiplied by the capital contributed. Capital contributed. Now the preferred amount is going to go based on the original capital, because that is what the investors are going to be looking at. They're not going to be looking at, investors don't necessarily know explicitly about this acquisition fee. If they ask, they probably will be told about it. They should be told about it. But typically the investor is going to say, hey, I gave $200,000. I want, and my preferred rate is 3%. We agreed upon. So I want to have that calculation. I want to see that calculation. But here we have the waterfall return. The waterfall return is going to be the waterfall percentage multiplied by the return portion. And again, that return portion is their ownership multiplied by the return. So you take the return amount for the investor, and then you're going to multiply that by the percentage of the waterfall, but you want to take away their preferred return also, right? So we're removing however much they received from the preferred return, and then we're multiplying that difference by the waterfall. That makes sense. So in this case over here, they had $53,000 of the return portion, and they had $7,000. So we subtract 53 minus 7, right? And then we multiply it by 100%. Now over here, what we have is we're looking at 50%. So there's going to be, once we're done with this, there's going to be some difference between the total return and what is allocated, but you'll see what happens with that. So the investors waterfall to sponsors, right? So 100% minus here. Is there any waterfall percentage that is left over to be allocated to the sponsors? So not for the two sponsors, but for everybody else, there is. So if we go over here, we see that there is 50% left to be allocated, 30% in this case left to be allocated, 40% in this case, 30% again. So these are all the amounts of the waterfall, percentages of the waterfall that are left over from the investors to be allocated to the sponsors. So now that means that now also between the sponsors themselves, they can have an agreement about how much of the investors or what portion of the investors waterfall will go to each of the sponsors. One sponsor might be responsible for bringing in an investor, and so they might get the lion's share of that investor's additional waterfall percentage. So for example, if we look at this one over here, this only 10% of the leftovers from this investor are going to go to sponsor one, whereas 90% are going to go to sponsor two. And so for example, if we look at how much this investor E, received both from the preferred return and from the waterfall, they received $5,301.02. But the return portion should be $10,102. So there's going to be, so if we subtract the difference over there, the 10,000 minus the sum of those two, and we multiply it by the 10%, that is going to give us how much of that difference is going to go to this investor and how much is going to go to the sponsor two. Sponsor one split, sponsor two split. So look over here, they're going to get $480 of it and 4,321. So this total of 4,801 is really going to be this number over here minus the sum of those two numbers. It's going to give us the $4,801.02. And we're going to look at the sum over here as well, just to kind of see what they're equal to. And that is the same. So that is what we're doing. We're allocating the difference of the return portion for that investor, subtracting the amount they actually receive. That difference we're allocating between the sponsors. The sponsors are the ones that make the deal happen. The deals happen. They're going to be the ones who determine how the return is going to be. It's going to be allocated. They have an incentive to get the highest return possible, because the more the return is, the more they're going to get. So that is essentially what's happening so far. Now, if we look at the total return that they're getting is that. Now, because they get this return, they're going to get, if assuming they don't have it paid out to them, their new capital balance is going to be added to the amount after the acquisition fee. So they don't get their original capital because they paid to the acquisition fee, but you add that to the total return that they are owed or that they receive, and that's going to give you the new capital balance. Now, if we want to know what the percentage return is, right? So they're going to have this new capital balance is going to be this 28,872 divided by their original balance. So they had a return of 15%. So this is what now you think about this 15% over how many days? 152 days, right? So they get 15% return over 152 days. If you annualize it, right? Say how much, what's the annual percentage rate? It's 37%, right? So they just made 37% on their money, and it's real estate. And that is a very good percentage return. Can you think of any other asset, any other investment where you will get that kind of returns? I can't. So that's that. If you look at everybody's over here, they have their percentage rate. Now, obviously, they're going to have the most. It's worth taking a look over here really quickly at the formula for the sponsors. Because essentially, the sponsors over here, he is getting 100% of his own, and he's getting 100% of his own, right? This is going to be the 42,857. This is going to be the 53,571. And the other sponsor is not going to get any portion of the second sponsors or the other sponsors return, not like with the straight investors where part of it is allocated. So then as far as the total return goes for this, for the sponsor slash investor, it's going to be, they're going to get, so this sponsor one gets, as we mentioned before, right? We're looking at the 10%. These are going to be the percentages that go to sponsor one. So sponsor one is going to get 10% of the difference, like we said, and they're going to get 50% of the difference, and et cetera, et cetera. So the total, they're going to get 108,368. If you want to know what they're going to get of the difference from just the investors, it's the 54,796 plus their own. So they get 108,368. That takes you over here. This is just on this deal, ladies and gentlemen. So if you look at this, these are the total returns allocated, which brings you up to $450,000. And then so their new capital balance is going to be this 108,000 plus their capital balance after acquisition. And for the investors as well, like we said before, so that means the total, and then we get a new capital balance, which brings us to 1.45 million. And just keep in mind, there was a $50,000 that was already paid out for the acquisition fee. And then their return is actually annualized 260%, 426%, with just that short period of time, basically doubling his money, almost tripling sponsor number two's money. So that is essentially how we have a waterfall agreement. And this is the spreadsheet, the calculation, the formula for an investor or a sponsor that wants to assess what each of the investors or sponsors will be getting. So you could literally plug numbers in here. Let's say you expect to sell the property for $2 million. Let's say you expect to hold it for, instead of 6 months or 5 months, whatever this is, you expect to hold it for 1 year. So these are the expected returns. You could play around with putting different numbers inside of here. But if let's say you're an investor, let's say you're a sponsor, and you want to know, hey, if so-and-so they contribute capital in the amount of 200,000, what's going to happen to them down the line? And also you can say, hey, let's say you can negotiate with them for 3%, right? So you can see how all of these are impacted, how all of them play out under the various scenarios. I hope you found this interesting, enjoyable, educational, and if you liked what you saw, please give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you liked and if there's anything else you would like for me to go over. Have a great rest of your day.